I was sitting in a coffee shop yesterday with a close friend, a creative director who prides herself on having distinctly unique taste. She was scrolling through her feed, practically glowing, showing me this obscure new subculture she'd discovered. She kept saying how it felt like a pure expression of her inner self, how the platform had finally connected her with a tribe of true individualists. To her, this stream of content was proof of her specific personal brand, a digital sanctuary that was entirely her own. But then I took a closer look at what was actually on her screen. It was uncanny. The lighting in the videos, the specific cadence of the voiceovers, even the exact shade of beige in the background, it wasn't unique at all. In fact, it was identical to a trend I'd seen a teenager scrolling through on the subway just an hour earlier, and eerily similar to the content targeting me last week. That moment of dissonance was striking. She believed she was meticulously designing a custom home, distinct and free. But from where I sat, it looked like she had just moved into a prefabricated unit that millions of others were already living in. It forced a chilling question. Are we actually the architects of our digital lives? Or are we just oblivious tenants in a house designed to make us all look, think, and feel exactly the same? That moment, that profound realization that our drive for unique individual expression is constantly being subverted by algorithmic conformity, that's really the core engine of this deep dive.
Right.
Our mission today is to move past the surface critique of social media, the usual stuff, and really delve into the foundational forces driving this dissonance. We need to look critically at the nature of imitation, or mimesis, and how its intense, accelerated amplification in digital spaces is fundamentally reshaping our individual minds, restructuring our politics, and fraying the very fabric of civil society.
And it's absolutely essential that we do, because this isn't just about Instagram trends. The argument is that we need a fundamental shift in how we even view ourselves as people.
Oh, so?
Well, we're all sort of accustomed to thinking of the human subject as purely rational, the autonomous Homo sapiens. The thinking man.
Right, the person who makes logical choices.
Exactly. But if you look closely at how we actually learn, how we form our identities, how we interact in groups, the reality is far more, slippery. The subject that emerges is less the thinking man and more Homo Mimeticus, the embodied, relational, and deeply affected creature who is constantly and often unconsciously mirroring the world around them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when most of us hear the word mimesis or imitation, we think of something really simple. Surface-level copying.
Like a child drawing a picture or a parrot repeating a phrase.
Yeah, exactly. But you're telling us this is actually a deep protein and complex engine that drives our identity.
That's the core idea. We have to introduce mimesis not as mere visual copying, but as a foundational, complex phenomenon that underpins almost everything we do. It's an umbrella concept. It covers identification, affective contagion, feeling the mood of a room.
Right.
It also covers subconscious suggestion and these involuntary mirroring reflexes that operate completely below our conscious awareness.
So if you accept this premise that the contemporary subject is primarily relational, embodied, and affective, Homo Mimeticus, what does that do to our older ideas about ourselves?
Well, it fundamentally challenges the traditional Enlightenment idea of the fully autonomous, self-possessed, and purely rational subject, the person who stands apart from the world to judge it. Our experience, in this view, is not a solo endeavor, it's a shared state.
And it makes sense that, philosophically, the concept of imitation has always made the rationalists a bit nervous. It sort of implies a lack of originality, or maybe even authenticity.
Oh, it certainly has a contentious history. For millennia, the philosophical tradition has treated mimesis defensively. You look back to Plato, for instance, in the Republic. He famously critiqued poets and actors.
Because they were just imitators.
They were masters of imitation. He was worried they were generating false representations, illusory content, and that this would mislead us away from the true world of pure ideas. So this defensive stance sees imitation as being opposed to truth or true knowledge.
But that critique misses something huge, doesn't it?
It misses the fact that imitation is absolutely central to successful learning and human development. Any teacher knows this. Successful learning relies heavily not just on, say, repeating facts, but crucially on imitation and identification with influential models. The ability to imitate, to take on the form of an outside example, is a necessary prerequisite for any kind of creation.
So if it's so central to our development, it can't just be a cold cognitive function. It has to be driven by something more fundamental, something emotional.
And that's where we introduce this crucial concept of mimetic pathos.
Pathos, the feeling.
The shared emotional state. We're talking about the relational power of human bodies to be unconsciously affected by others through a shared sympathy, some pathos, which literally means feeling with.
This isn't a thought process. It's not like you analyze someone's emotion and then decide to feel it.
No, it's immediate. It's an unconscious transfer of feeling. This shared effect, this pathos, is vital because it's the necessary condition for a relational embodied subject to even be born. We need to be able to feel what the person across from us is feeling just to survive and relate.
I mean, see this in everyday life all the time. Contagious yawning is the classic example.
Absolutely.
Or just walking into a room and instantly feeling the tension or the relaxation of the people already there. These are immediate, involuntary, affective states.
They are. And this insight is what makes the connection to Nietzsche so powerful. Decades before we had the technology to physically observe these processes in the brain, Nietzsche was calling for a genuine physiopsychology.
Bridging the physical body and the mind.
He essentially bridged the body and the psyche. He noted that the involuntary imitation of others' facial expressions and their bearing helps the child understand the mother during ontogenesis, the development of the individual.
And he didn't just see this as some sweet developmental tool. He rooted it in something very primal, right? Survival.
Absolutely. He argued this involuntary mimicking is rooted in a profound timidity and threat assessment. Through millennia of evolution, humans perceived everything strange as a potential danger.
So you copy to understand.
You immediately and involuntarily imitate the expression and bearing of the perceived threat, or, the person whose intentions you needed to decipher. And through that, you could draw fast, necessary conclusions about the intentions behind it. It was a rapid, unconscious risk assessment system. So we are literally built to mirror to survive.
And then fast forward to the 1990s, and this ancient philosophical observation about involuntary imitation and understanding suddenly finds physical grounding.
It did, with the discovery of mirror neurons. This gives empirical credibility to Nietzsche's insight. Researchers found that the simple sight of gestures or emotions or facial expressions triggers an unconscious reflex in the observer's brain to internally reproduce them.
So when I see you smile, part of my brain is smiling too.
In a sense, yes. And this internal reproduction isn't just mindless copying, it's the very mechanism that leads to you understanding my intention or my emotion. This discovery basically confirms that the mimetic unconscious, the involuntary mirroring mechanism, is the relational matrix out of which both language and consciousness are born. It powerfully precedes the rational logos.
Okay, so if we are always operating on this foundational, unconscious, affective level, this mimetic pathos, it means we are radically permeable. We are constantly drawing in external influences and reproducing them internally. And this permeability, especially when it's amplified in groups, sets the stage for what we might call political pathology.
That's the crucial pivot. The history of mimesis is therefore intimately linked to psychological concepts like hypnosis, suggestion, and contagious trance, especially in the context of masses and crowds.
We tend to think of hypnosis as something fringe, like a stage show.
Right, or theatrical. But figures like Hippolyte Bernheim studied these as pre-Freudian, non-pathological conditions.
He saw suggestion not as a sickness, but as a pervasive state.
Precisely. Bernheim's big argument was that hypnosis wasn't some pathological state reserved for hysterics or a small minority of people. Instead, it was a pervasive state that reveals how every subject is unconsciously vulnerable to mirroring mechanisms and suggestion.
So in a highly suggestive state, you lose a part of yourself.
In a sense, you're deprived of your own proper identity. You become hyper-attuned to the external signal. And this sets the framework for understanding mass phenomena.
Which gives us the perfect dramatic case study. The Woody Allen film, Zelig, the Human Chameleon.
Zelig is a brilliant, though comedic, dramatization of the sheer power of mimesis. Zelig, the main character, unconsciously mirrors everyone he is near. He instantly changes his appearance, his class, his accent, even his political affiliations to conform.
His entire life is defined by a pathological will to mime.
An overwhelming drive to adapt and fit in. He becomes a doctor when he's talking to doctors. He becomes Jewish when talking to Jews. He becomes a Nazi when he's talking to Nazis. It's an extreme pathology.
But the film's critical insight wasn't just about how strange this one man was. It was about how typical he was at the time.
Exactly. The film argues that Zelig's chameleon-like behavior was not exceptional. Rather, it mirrored wider hypnotic and imitative tendencies that were massively shared in modern social life. This age of mass media and crowds was constitutive of what was called the age of the crowd, where individuals are dispossessed of a proper, stable self and are instead constantly adopting scripted roles based on their immediate environment.
So the phenomenon of zeal wasn't about a unique mental illness.
No, it was a hyperbolic reflection of universal suggestibility.
And this leads us to the darkest possible manifestation of mass conformity, which is the discussion around the banality of evil, specifically Hannah Arendt's observation of Adolf Eichmann. The mimetic lens offers a devastating reinterpretation of that famous phrase.
Arndt's controversial observation during Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem was that he suffered from an inability to think, a deficient logos.
He wasn't a monster. He was just a bureaucrat, a paper pusher who simply followed orders without reflection.
That was her argument. But if we shift to a mimetic perspective, the diagnosis changes entirely. It suggests that Eichmann didn't have a lack of thought. He possessed an excess of pathos.
An excess of feeling. Or maybe an excess of conformity.
Both. He had an embodied, all-too-mimetic ability to feel and adopt that irrational Volkish idea. The national spirit fanatically submitting to the dominant administration and performing a scripted role. He wasn't a thinker resisting the system. He was the perfect functionary, possessed by an external phantom ego dictated by the ruling ideology.
So his ability to perform the prescribed role, to enthusiastically manage train schedules to concentration camps while feeling no personal responsibility, that's the ultimate act of mimetic surrender.
Precisely. His problem wasn't a void of thought, but a complete dispossession of individual identity achieved through hypnotic social influence. The evil becomes banal because it doesn't require monstrous, individualized intent. It simply requires the average person's ability to surrender their self to a mass-scripted conforming role.
So the inability to think is seen as a consequence of this mimetic surrender, not the original cause.
That's the core realization. Whether it's Zelig morphing into a new persona or a Nazi bureaucrat raising his arm in a collective salute, the dispossession of a proper individual identity through hypnotic influence is constitutive of the banality of evil. It is a profound warning that the human subject is far more permeable, far more easily possessed by external shared affect than we typically want to admit.
That discussion sets a critical foundation. We are a permeable subject, built to mirror, driven by unconscious affective forces. The most dangerous place for a permeable subject is inside an engineered echo chamber designed specifically to control that mirroring reflex.
And that brings us directly to the hyper-accelerated digital environment, where this unconscious engine is now amplified on a massive scale.
To understand the modern dilemma, we have to look at the foundational American civic pathology that actually predates the internet by almost 2 centuries. And the observer was Alexis de Tocqueville, who examined the young democracy in the 1830s and identified a distinct concept he called individualism.
Tocqueville's definition of individualism is so crucial here because it's often confused with simple egoism or selfishness today. They're not the same thing, at least not at first.
Right. So what was his definition?
He defined individualism as a reasoned and peaceful sentiment initially that disposes each citizen to isolate themselves from the mass of their fellows. It's a preference for private rights over public rights, a tendency to focus on one's inner group, your friends, your family, your immediate private interests, rather than the needs of the wider community or the nation.
So it's not immediately malicious, but it's a narrowing of focus,
Yeah.
a shrinking of one's world.
Exactly. He distinguished it very sharply from egoism, which is the self-impassion that drives one to think only of oneself. Individualism first only dries up the source of public virtues, limiting a citizen's duties to their small, private circle.
But Tocqueville was prophetic. He had a warning.
He feared that over the long term, individualism, while distinct from egoism at first, would eventually attack and destroy all the others and eventually become absorbed in egoism. The civic responsibilities would diminish, and ultimately democracy itself would suffer from a lack of necessary citizen input.
He saw this shrinking focus, this shift from a public, communal self to a private, insular self, as an existential threat to democratic vitality. Because democracy requires constant conversation, debate, and compromise among strangers.
It does.
So what was his countermeasure to this slide toward egoism?
His solution was greater community involvement and participation in local civil society. He argued that the American habit of forming local associations, things like town meetings, working together to fix roads, or forming school boards, forced people to consider the interests of others and work towards the common good.
Right. If you want a better road outside your house, you can't just pay for it yourself.
You have to talk to your neighbors, you have to compromise, and you have to build consensus. Tocqueville believed this active local participation in civil society was the true engine where American democracy flourished most brightly, pulling citizens out of their isolated shells.
So if we fast forward to the 21st century, social media platforms are, in a sense, the ultimate embodiment and accelerator of that individualist lifestyle Tocqueville warned about.
They are the digital expression of the inner circle. The platforms allow you to curate custom profiles, choose your followers, filter who you hear from, and build your own highly personalized digital inner circle. They encourage immediate, continuous communication within that small, private group.
It's modernized individualism.
It is. It provides the comfort of connection with friends and family anywhere, anytime, without ever requiring you to step outside, physically talk to a difficult neighbor, or compromise on a town issue.
But this immediate comfort comes with a devastating psychological and civic cost, and it's tied directly to the business model itself.
Former social media executives have been very clear about this. The key principle is, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product. The platforms have one singular, ruthless business goal: maximize the time you spend scrolling and interacting to maximize their profit from advertising.
They don't care about the truth of the content
Or the quality of the discourse. They care only about the numbers, engagement, and duration. That's it.
And to achieve that maximization, they use sophisticated techniques that explicitly target our Homo Mimeticus nature, our emotional, mirroring self.
Precisely. They are masters of effective targeting. They use sophisticated psychological techniques: the endless scrolling mechanic, the instant notification dopamine hit, the photo tagging, the ellipses that appear while someone is typing to create anxiety and anticipation.
And all that.
These techniques are designed not just to capture your attention, but to actively affect your emotion, to restructure your mind, and ultimately to trap and beguile you. The sources note that these platforms tickle us in propaganda, prompting users to seek more of the same, often content that is polarizing or emotionally intense, without ever triggering the user's conscious awareness that they are being manipulated.
And this continuous immersion in customized, emotionally charged, effectively targeted content creates the perfect condition for what the material calls hypermimesis.
Hypermimesis is the accelerated, massive version of what we were discussing earlier. The digital age, with its continuous, uninterrupted flow of news and images on smaller personal screens, TVs, computers, tablets, smartphones, it intensifies the power of images and effect to cast a spell.
It generates an intoxicating psychic dispossession. I love the phrase Black Mirrors.
It's a perfect description. This constant high-speed exposure leads to a massive, rapid, and contagious spread of imitation. It's an all-too-human tendency to conform and merge against dominant backgrounds, which is now radically amplified by new media and this enveloping technological environment.
And this digital amplification ties directly back into the decay of civic life that Tocqueville feared. We are seeing the effects that Robert Putnam warned about decades ago, only now hyper-accelerated by algorithms.
Putnam's classic work, Bowling Alone, observed that technology, primarily television at the time, was already eroding social capital in traditional civic groups, PTA groups, church attendance, neighborhood bowling leagues.
Right. He noted that as face-to-face social connections withered, Americans were increasingly watching the show Friends rather than having friends.
Exactly. And social media has taken that trend and blasted it into the stratosphere. People are now far more inclined to send a quick donation check to a national cause, which feels like participation, than to attend a local meeting and actively participate in the slow, difficult work of local democracy.
And the data on where people actually engage supports this idea that hypermimesis and the focus on national or global narratives actively neglects Tocqueville's prescribed solution: local engagement.
The contrast is stark. Social media tends to focus disproportionately on national or global political and social problems while neglecting local government involvement, the very place Tocqueville said democracy flourishes.
And the election data.
The numbers tell the story of indifference. Local election turnout in the towns studied often ranges from a shockingly low 13% to 23%. By contrast, national presidential election turnout is often significantly higher, sometimes exceeding 50% or 60%.
That's a huge gap.
It demonstrates that while national issues are receiving massive mimetic focus driven by high-intensity media campaigns and effective polarization, the local level, where your vote and your participation have the greatest practical and immediate influence, is being neglected and forgotten in favor of the emotional large-scale drama.
So, If the platforms succeed in trapping us in these individual digital bubbles, feeding us emotionally charged hypermimetic content, the inevitable consequence is the breakdown of critical thought and the collapse of civil discourse. This is often built on what the sources identify as the three great untruths.
Yes, and this moves us from the mechanism of mimesis to the intellectual content that has proliferated through those very channels. These untruths fundamentally undermine reasoned discussion and intellectual resilience.
And they're harmful.
Deeply harmful. They fly in the face of both ancient wisdom and modern psychological research on well-being. They actively harm the individuals and communities that embrace them, and their rise correlates sharply with increased rates of anxiety, depression, and ideological uniformity, particularly among young adults.
Okay, let's tackle untruth number one. The untruth of fragility, which is encapsulated by the belief, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
This untruth promotes what we call a culture of safetyism. The goal, paradoxically, becomes shielding individuals from any potential pain or discomfort. Now, the literal opposite Nietzsche's phrase, "what doesn't kill me makes me strong," is maybe an overstatement, but the core wisdom holds. Children, like all complex adaptive systems, are anti-fragile.
We hear that term, anti-fragile, used a lot, but it's critical here. It means systems don't just survive stress. They require it to function and improve.
Precisely. Think of the immune system. It requires exposure to age-appropriate challenges, germs, bacteria to develop robust defenses. Similarly, children and young adults require exposure to age-appropriate stressors, failures, disagreements, insults, and painful experiences to mature into resilient adults who can engage productively with challenging ideas without shattering.
So the goal of education, in this view, should be to make people think critically, not to guarantee they remain comfortable.
Exactly. But the proliferation of policies, often designed with good intentions, like policies favoring overprotection, universal trigger warnings, or overly strict speech codes, they often model cognitive distortions for students. They teach students that they are fragile and that words are inherently dangerous, thus actively promoting the untruth of fragility.
There's a great phrase that sums up the anti-fragile perspective. Prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. It feels like modern administrative practices have reversed that entirely.
They have. And that connects directly to the second untruth, which is arguably the most prevalent one online, the untruth of emotional reasoning, or the belief that you should always trust your feelings.
And given that we've established Homo Mimeticus as driven by pathos, by feeling, this untruth is weaponized when it's validated by bureaucracy.
It promotes profoundly flawed intellectual habits. Look, we're all prone to emotional reasoning and confirmation bias. That's just human nature. But the administrative bureaucracy of safetyism actively teaches these distortions as valid methods of discourse.
Give us an example.
Take the implementation of bias response teams, or lines, on campuses and in corporate environments. These systems are designed to make it easy for people to report each other, often anonymously, based purely on subjective feelings of bias or emotional discomfort.
So if the metric for reporting is emotional discomfort rather than an objective, verifiable standard, you are essentially validating feelings as facts.
That's the intellectual trap. This administrative environment actively teaches and validates cognitive distortions that clinical psychologists spend their entire careers trying to correct. It teaches catastrophizing. This uncomfortable statement will lead to the collapse of the world. And mind reading. I know that person's ambiguous comment must have been intended to harm me.
It's the opposite of something like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Exactly. CBT aims to show individuals that their thoughts and feelings are not always accurate reflections of reality. This administrative approach does the opposite, and it inevitably suggests that freedom of speech must be restricted because some individuals experience emotional discomfort, which actively chills speech and promotes intense distrust and self-censorship.
And finally, the third untruth, which is the tribal engine of our modern political polarization. The untruth of us versus them, or the belief that life is a battle between good people and evil people.
This taps into our deepest evolutionary tendency. The human mind evolved for tribal conflict. We readily divide the world into us and them, often based on the most trivial criteria.
It's contrary to a lot of ancient wisdom.
It is. It's contrary to the universal wisdom that acknowledges the moral complexity of the individual. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn famously put it, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. But when this tribal impulse is combined with modern intellectual concepts, like microaggression theory, which argues that small, often unintentional verbal slights are deeply damaging and represent systemic malice, it leads directly to a pervasive, unforgiving call-out culture.
And that call-out culture is the perfect digital expression of hypermimesis. The speed and reach of the platforms just weaponize the tribal judgment.
It creates a volatile situation where almost anything one says or does can result in instantaneous public shaming and professional ruin. And it's often based on someone else's uncharitable interpretation or even a deliberate misinterpretation, amplified by thousands of people who are mirroring the collective outrage.
The consequences on places like college campuses, which should be bastions of free inquiry, are severe.
It engenders self-censorship, the sense of walking on eggshells. This kind of atmosphere, dominated by moral outrage and the fear of being socially outcast, is fundamentally incompatible with the university's core mission, which requires free inquiry, dissent, evidence-based argument, and intellectual honesty.
The ultimate dramatic expression of this morally homogeneous us versus them dynamic is the phenomenon of the modern-day witch hunt.
Yes. Cohesive and morally homogeneous groups, that is, groups where dissent is absent or punished, are highly prone to witch hunts, especially when they perceive an internal or external threat to their moral purity.
And these events are terrifyingly predictable. They fit a historical pattern.
They fit 4 historical characteristics. First, they seem to come out of nowhere. They escalate with incredible speed from nothing. Second, they involve charges of crimes against the collective moral contamination or treason against the ideology. Third, the offenses that lead to those charges are often trivial, ambiguous, or even fabricated.
And the fourth characteristic is the most chilling, and it relates directly back to mimetic conformity.
That's the critical one. People who know the accused is innocent keep quiet or even join the mob out of intense, immediate fear of becoming the next target. The sources cite contemporary examples where these intense events started over things as simple as politely worded emails questioning a new policy.
And they escalated from there.
They quickly escalated into demands that the authors be fired. The attendant fears are channeled in unjust and destructive ways. This pattern, professors or colleagues joining open letters to denounce their own colleagues or demanding retractions, fits the witch hunt profile exactly. And this is a direct consequence of the lack of viewpoint diversity. When viewpoint diversity declines substantially, as data shows it has among academics and students since the 1990s, a community's susceptibility to this pattern skyrockets. The ability to resist the mimetic wave of outrage is lost.
This intense tribalism, this fear, and the resulting radical self-censorship. It leads us directly to the realm of high politics, where this emotional hypermimesis is manifesting as effective polarization, a polarization driven not by ideas, but by raw hatred and fear.
We need to detail the rise of effective polarization because it's distinct from simple policy disagreement. It's defined by people increasingly hating, fearing, and fundamentally distrusting the opposing political party and the individuals within it.
This isn't about the tax code. This is personal.
Exactly. This type of polarization, the emotional distance, has steadily increased in the United States since the 1980s, but it received a massive boost with the proliferation of platforms that monetize outrage.
And we can actually see this shift in the data around how politicians are judged. The rise of social media seems to coincide with the dramatic break in how this polarization expresses itself at the highest levels of government.
The historical data on presidential approval rates shows a clear divergence point. It coincides with the maturation of platforms like Facebook and Twitter into major political forces. Prior to the Obama administration, partisan approval rates for a president tended to track somewhat symmetrically.
Meaning they'd go up and down together, more or less.
Right. Even if one party disapproved, their approval rate might follow a similar trend line to the incumbent party, just lower. However, the pattern breaks dramatically post-Obama. Partisan approval rates diverge sharply. As the incumbent party's approval goes up, the opposing party's approval goes down, indicating an active emotional repulsion and rising cross-party hatred. The timing strongly suggests that social media platforms are playing a significant role in amplifying this effective polarization by feeding users emotionally charged, tribal content that confirms their untruths of us versus them.
Beyond just fueling hatred of the other side, we have to consider what this emotional, rapid-fire consumption of politics is doing to citizens' actual ability to engage with issues and information critically.
The results are alarming. Studies show that people who primarily depend on social media for their political news have significantly lower overall political knowledge compared to those who use traditional news websites, radio, or print media.
That feels intuitive, but is there data?
There is. One key study demonstrated that among those depending on social media, a majority, 57%, had low political knowledge. Compare that to those who rely on established news websites, where only 23% were categorized as having low political knowledge.
That validates the argument that the digital environment promotes a type of thinking that is fast and emotional rather than slow and considered.
Exactly. This kind of rapid exposure encourages thinking that is, and I quote, too fast, too incomplete, too emotional, and too untrustworthy. It trains users to think quickly, often relying only on explosive headlines, forming immediate opinions based on emotional contagion, and making them fundamentally untrustworthy of any opposing viewpoint that doesn't fit the effective narrative they have adopted. This severely compromises the possibility of any kind of constructive political debate.
This state of modernity, this liberal world defined by runaway conformity, emotional chaos, and civic decay, has prompted a profound philosophical response. And the ultimate intellectual critique of liberalism comes from figures like Peter Thiel, whose worldview grounds a powerful anti-enlightenment stance, rooted in two extremely specific and intense intellectual frameworks.
To understand Thiel's politics, you have to understand his anti-enlightenment critique. He sees the liberal order, with its emphasis on rationality, universal rights, and process, as fundamentally flawed and ultimately doomed.
And this is all framed within a particular theology.
It is, within a Christian eschatology, the theology of the end times, which views historical time as linear and culminating in a final apocalyptic end. Thiel views the Antichrist not necessarily as a singular person, but as a totalitarian system. A runaway, globally encompassing liberalism that becomes a one-world government suppressing freedom in the name of safety and universal conformity. This framework is instrumental. It subordinates reason to these mythic structures and justifies beliefs that serve the higher purposes of creating order and meaning, regardless of whether they're empirically falsifiable.
And the first of his intellectual pillars for criticizing liberalism is this Girardian mimetic theory we've been touching on.
Thiel uncritically adopts the entire framework of René Girard. As we established, Girard posits that human desire is fundamentally imitative. We don't desire things intrinsically, we desire them because other people desire them.
Which creates competition.
It creates intense triangular competition between two people over the same object, leading inevitably to conflict and systemic violence. Girard believed that all human culture is founded on hidden, unacknowledged scapegoating, where the community vents its collective violence onto an innocent victim to restore temporary peace.
So, mimetic desire, left unchecked, leads to self-destruction.
Precisely. And for Girard, Christianity is unique because Christ's teachings, such as the instruction to turn the other cheek, reveal the scapegoat mechanism and introduce a radical path of non-retaliatory violence. This action substitutes peace for vengeance as the new divine mimetic desire to be imitated. Thiel assumes this entire theory, that mimetic desire is the foundation of human violence and that Christian revelation destabilized all previous cultural orders, is correct, historically operative, and provides the only way forward.
Okay, that sets the stage for the second pillar, which lends his critique its real political force, the work of the controversial German jurist Carl Schmitt.
Schmitt provides a trenchant, brutal critique of liberalism. He views politics not as a gentle exchange of ideas or a bureaucratic process, but as fundamentally agonistic and existential. His analysis centers on the inevitable friend-enemy distinction.
He argues that the definition of the political is centered on the ability to recognize and confront an existential enemy.
Exactly. And it's crucial to acknowledge Schmitt's deeply problematic historical association. He joined the Nazi Party in the 1930s, though he was later marginalized. Nonetheless, his intellectual framework on the nature of political structure resonates powerfully with Thiel's deep skepticism of modern consensus.
Schmitt's most famous concept is about the sovereign's ability to operate outside the normal legal framework, what he called the state of exception.
This is the centerpiece of his critique. Schmitt famously argued, "Sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception." He posits that political order does not rest solely on written laws or rational codification, but on foundational, non-rational decisions that occur outside the normal legal flow, the moment when the rules must be suspended entirely to save the order itself.
Like in a major constitutional crisis or a civil war.
Right. He argued that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are just secularized theological concepts. The omnipotent God corresponds to the all-powerful sovereign lawgiver. The sovereign's capacity to suspend the law mirrors God's capacity for a miraculous interventionist action.
So Schmidt is arguing that the liberal faith in predictable, rational rules is ultimately a delusion, because when real conflict hits, it's raw existential decision-making that matters. And Thiel draws on this skepticism of liberal democracy itself.
They both express profound concerns about the limitations and contradictions of liberal democracy. Schmidt argued that genuine democracy, which is implementing the unified collective will of the people, might fundamentally conflict with liberalism, which cherishes treating all people equally as rights bearers, regardless of their collective will. Schmidt even suggested that a dictator could be a true democratic figure if he truly implemented the will of the people.
And Thiel's concern.
His concern, which is fueled by Girardian ideas of runaway desire, is that democracy just devolves into mob rule, that it's fueled by hypermimesis, emotional contagion, and the inevitable scapegoating that follows.
This philosophical blend, Girard's inherent violence and Schmidt's authoritarian realism, it culminates in Thiel's highly urgent apocalyptic framework.
He views the growing ideological conflicts, the instability of discourse, and the perceived decline of rational order as fully justifying an extreme, decisive, and even authoritarian response. Thiel's apocalyptic yearning for an end to the current system is seen by his critics as a vehicle for advancing his specific political project, justifying an authoritarian pushback against a modernity he believes is fundamentally lost and self-destructive.
And as critics would point out.
Critics are quick to point out that this framework requires ignoring the empirical reality that the post-war liberal order he disdains represents a period of unprecedented peace, growth, and stability. But for Thiel, the framework's power lies in its ability to create a unifying, orienting worldview that binds his community together and justifies radical action.
So when you put all of this together, the psychological permeability of the mimetic subject, the algorithmic amplification of feeling, the collapse of civic life, the trivialized political discourse, and then the philosophical justification for rejecting the liberal order, it paints a complicated and frankly a volatile picture of modern existence.
It forces us to confront a profound tension that defines our age. We feel this intense individual drive for unique expression, but that drive is constantly being subverted and channeled by unconscious, mimetic pathos that's amplified by platform algorithms.
And this phenomenon manifests in society in two different ways.
Two great, seemingly contradictory outflows. On one hand, you see mass conformity. The beige singularity we talked about, digital narcissism, hypermimesis, everyone starts to look, think, and feel the same. On the other hand, you see intense political conflict, effective polarization, widespread call-out culture, and the outright philosophical rejection of the principles necessary for liberal debate and compromise.
The core lesson here, then, is that our self-conception as the autonomous, self-sufficient, rational Homo sapiens is largely a phantom.
It is. Homo Mimeticus is radically permeable and vulnerable to external influences, operating largely below our conscious awareness. The subject is easily possessed by a shared affect, whether that impulse comes from the charismatic trance of a political leader, the kind of force that powered 1930s fascism, or the low-level hypnotic spell cast by continuous scrolling through a digital black mirror.
So the phantom of the ego is constantly being drawn and redrawn, not by our rational will, but by forces outside its rational control.
Exactly. Which underscores why intellectual humility and critical distance are now more essential than ever for survival.
This inherent plasticity of human nature, our ability to receive form, to be molded by our environment, is simultaneously the source of our deepest communal bonds, allowing us to empathize and relate, and yet it's also the source of our most profound political vulnerabilities, allowing us to be swept away by mob rule and outrage. The very quality that allows us to create form and meaning is also the thing that makes us susceptible to genius and terror alike.